be great. Okay, so my name is Mariel Cartwright. I am the lead animator of Skullgirls, and welcome to my very first talk, Fluid and Powerful Animation Within Frame Restrictions. I was just curious. I know Jaleel did the, who here is an animator thing earlier, but I was wondering if anyone here is a 2D animator? Okay, awesome. We have a couple. Okay, that's good. We're going to cover a few things here today. I want to go over a few basic animation principles, which might be old hat to some of you guys, but I want to go over specifically how they relate to gameplay and how to work within your game's restrictions to get the best animation possible. Again, my experience has been in 2D so far, so that's what I'm going to cover, but hopefully 3D animators can get something out of this as well. Oh, and there was my overview. Okay, who am I? I started in the industry in 2009, so I'm still kind of a newcomer. I started freelancing for WayForward, Ubisoft, and I actually didn't put Konami there, but I did that as well. In 2010, I started working on a little indie project called Skullgirls, which was later picked up by a developer and a publisher and became my full-time job as lead animator, and I've been doing that since. If you weren't aware, Skullgirls is a 2D fighting game for PSN, XBLA, and Steam, and I think the thing that makes it special is that it's entirely hand animated, so every frame is drawn by a person. Uh-oh, I lost my thing. Okay, let's go over some animation principles. Silhouette. Silhouette is always important, but in games where your characters need to move and read incredibly fast, silhouette is especially imperative. If you're punching, you need to see their fist, and if you're kicking, if you're blocking, it needs to read as a defensive stance. Here are a few examples that I feel are just examples of good silhouette. I think that even though their motions aren't just normal punches or kicks, their attitude and their posing makes it very clear. Anticipation. Anticipation is incredibly important. Without it, you don't even know an attack is coming. You don't even punch without winding up first. Anticipation is what's going to give your move contrast, help it read, and give it power. Even if it's short, I think having something to indicate winding up before throwing your punch is going to make it look better. I have an example here. This move is only 6 frames. It's a weak move in Skullgirls. And even though she's kind of a weird design, having 1 frame of her snake dragon guy, Leviathan, opening his mouth before smearing and snapping shut helps the move read better. And even though it is only 1 frame, you don't really see it, I think, but you feel it, which is what counts. And I do want to make a small note about anticipation, because we all work in games, well, most of us at least. I think we all know that there is a difference between animating your player character and your enemy character. Your player has to respond to button presses by a player, so they have to be pretty instantaneous, whereas your enemies actually have to have a lot of wind-up, so your player has time to react by dodging or blocking or running away. So you find that you might actually not have time for a ton of anticipation in your player character's animations, and we'll go over how to tackle that in a second. Okay, so we can just jump right into animating. First thing is favoring your keys. I think everyone knows about ease in and ease out, and I've realized that for what I'm doing, where I only have so many frames to work with, I really need to focus on my keys to make my poses read. I don't usually have as many frames as I'd like to get a super smooth motion, so I make my in-betweens favor my keys as much as possible and build toward them to make everything read and be clearer. I think you can see in this animation that it's basically only 2 poses. There's no in-between that's kind of just right in the middle. But I think that because I favored my keys and focused on them, the overall motion reads as very clear and snappy. Okay, follow through. So you're favoring your keys, and you find that your gaps are actually a little bit too big. The spacing is too big. You can use follow through to fill in the gaps. That is stuff like hair, clothes, a big billowing cape. I think even if you have a character in 1 pose, just a single frame, seeing where her hair and her clothes are flowing from gives an indication of the motion she just made. This is also how you'd make a move without anticipation work. You could snap right into your active key pose, that is that punching frame, and use follow through as the missing information. Use it as your missing link between your idle and your key. Go straight into your punch and then have everything else catch up to it, and that will sell your motion. This stuff might all seem basic because they're all animation principles, but I think knowing how to use them effectively in a game setting is what's going to help you cut down frames and make your animation more effective. Okay, you need good smears. Smears will also help you fill in those gaps if you find that your spacing is large. You should never underestimate how much a good smear will help sell your motion. This move featuring the Skullgirls character Misfortune is basically entirely sold by its smear. Here are a few examples from some other games. I tried to pick ones that were all different styles, but obviously you can kind of just go nuts and do whatever. In any case, even though they're only one frame, there's a lot of information here. You can tell the pose they're coming from, the motion they're currently making, obviously, and where they're going to end up. So with one good smear, you're actually telling the player a lot of information. My thing just went weird. You're telling them a lot of information, and you can just convey a lot. Okay, overshoot. This is something I found that really helps amp up your animations, and I try to make sure to have it in anything that's an impact. So it doesn't quite work for for swings, but that's what we have smears for anyways. I think it should be obvious that when you animate an attack, you don't want to ease into it. I found that having one frame, overshooting your final key, and then pulling back into it helps give it power and helps it read and just be snappy and strong. It's also worth mentioning that, like what I've done here, you can combine your smear and your overshoot, and also remember that to put it before your hit frame because it's meant to give the impression of impact. In this animation of Makoto from Street Fighter Third Strike, you can see that right before hitting her attack key, she reaches forward beyond it and then pulls back into it, and it helps it read as a stronger impact. And I think also her sleeve catching up afterwards helps give it contrast, which helps it read better. These are all things that you don't necessarily see, but it helps the impact feel stronger and just feel a lot better. Okay, breaking the body. It's a little gruesome. This is something everyone should also remember, so let's go over it again. This is something when you're moving fast, you can just really go nuts on your in-betweens, and you can have some crazy drag that snaps into your key. It's another thing, I'm going to go over this a lot. It's a thing that you don't see, but you feel. Here are a few examples from other games. You can see that all these poses aren't physically possible, but having this kind of drag and weight is what's going to help your move look more powerful. Remember that you can lead a motion with a different body part than what your final key is. So say you're throwing a punch, you can throw their shoulder or just their entire body forward first before coming around and then swinging their arm. I think, actually going back to this example with Valentine, she moves her entire body upwards, striking this really weird pose that she's doing before moving upwards and then snapping her arm, overshooting, and then pulling back into it. And I think even though that frame is really weird looking, you don't see it in the final animation. And remember that we are all animating. This is something I'm guilty of sometimes, but you have to remember you don't have to make every drawing look perfect as long as your motion is reading. Remember your foundations as an artist, but don't be afraid to break a few bones if it's going to help your motion look better. Remember that you're creating movement, not individual pieces of art. Okay, let's bring it back to games. I think it'll help to go over a bit of how we made Skullgirls, because I think the key thing to making it work for us was in our process. So here's a quick illustration of the different stages a character in Skullgirls will go through. After the brainstorm, we very quickly and roughly animate a move based on general frame counts of what, like a weak, a medium, a hard, or hit stuns or specials, just all these things. We will very quickly animate it just knowing based on that stuff. We then pass it to our designer, who implements it in the game as a rough and makes it pretty much fully playable with hitboxes and all that. We then give it back to the animator with any notes or tweaks that we have to make. And then we finish it up, pass it to our cleanup, who adds the colors and the lines, and then we implement it once again. It's fully animated, so, it's fully animated and it's playable very early on. So that means, I'm losing it, sorry. I'm so nervous. It's playable when it's very rough. And so we can take the time to test it while it's super rough, while we can polish up the art. Okay, remember what kind of game you're making. In Skullgirls, our rule of thumb, which we kind of always break, but we have general frame counts of what a weak, a medium, a hard move should be and how they generally work. So that means the artist can have fun with the visual as long as it's clear and it adheres to gameplay. So our designer says, we need this. Our animator says, I'd like it to look like this. The designer says, it should work like this. And then the animator makes it work. Okay. This might be unique to Skullgirls because we do implement everything frame by frame, but we can take liberties with what's held for how long. A lot of the times we found that holding frames at even intervals, say the traditional equivalent of animating on twos, just leads us to wasting frames. So instead, you can focus on holding your keys and then building toward them, and then your animation will look better without using more frames. So here I have an example from Skullgirls. This is an example of an animation we made look better just by fixing the timing. On the left is the older version, which we held everything at even intervals for. And for us, that was holding everything for 3 frames at 60 FPS. And then we just tweaked the timing, and we ended up holding the key poses longer and the smears shorter. And hopefully you can see that just by adding a few holds makes the animation a lot snappier. It's subtle, but it's such a small difference that it's really easy to make, and it does count in the end. Sorry, I'm a little sniffly. I also want to mention something we call hit stop. This is where you freeze the pose of the characters on an impact before playing the rest of the animation. This is more on the programmers than it is the animators, but I think this is also something worth mentioning. It's just going to help your impacts feel a lot stronger. And we found that impacts actually tend to look a little watery or weak without it. Okay, this is short, but transitioning to and from the idle, I have found that you should actually have bigger spacing around your idle pose. When I started, I thought that just easing into it was the way to go, and we found ourselves removing the frames I was drawing around the idle because it just slowed down the animation. I was forgetting that the idle animation is a motion, and you don't want to ease into another motion. So the key to making it work was actually just having that larger spacing. And at least for fighting games, you don't want to go too nuts on the idle because it impacts the responsiveness of the rest of the game if you just have people returning to their idle forever. And remember that your gameplay is king. Remember that we are all making games, and gameplay is the most important thing. Find ways to work with your designer. You may be able to animate the most beautiful jump with a ton of anticipation and this graceful landing, but it's not going to do your game any good if it doesn't work with the gameplay. Okay, so let's put it together. This applies mostly for attacks, which is most of what I've gone over anyways, but I try to think of a move in 4 parts: the anticipation, the smear, the main attack key, and the return to idle. I think if you think of an attack in these parts, you can see how few frames it takes to get an action across. Having these parts means you can get it down to as little as 5 to 6 frames, which is what a weak move in Skullgirls is. The key thing is just to think about it like this, and you can actually do a lot with it. Okay, so here's everyone's favorite part. This is where I screwed up. I've been working on Skullgirls for 4 years now, which is kind of crazy, and I think it would be fair to say that had I the chance, I would go back and change a few things. So the first thing I'm going to call fluid versus overanimated. When I started, I was just pouring frames into my animation, and I didn't know how to effectively apply any of the principles I just talked about. I just wanted everything to look as smooth as possible, and I didn't realize how effective your animation could be just by being smarter about it. So this is one of the moves that stands out to me as one of the most over-animated things I did. It was one of the first things I did, and the funny thing about this one is that it became a standard. So now every character has this move where she gets hit, she falls to her knees, and then to the ground, and so now every character has this move that's this over-animated. I think everything, it's a little jittery, it lacks impact, it's just kind of weightless, and it's also 21 frames, which is actually a lot for us now. Again, we have moves that are as little as 6 that read as a full complete motion, so that this is 21 is kind of a lot. So this is the same move. I just removed frames. I didn't actually redraw any of it. And I removed 6 frames that I thought were kind of redundant, that didn't add to the overall motion. And I think you can see that it feels a lot snappier. It's definitely faster, so if we wanted to keep it to the same time in the game, I would have to redo more than this. But I think overall it just feels better, it's snappier, and it's less frames without actually losing the overall impact of the animation. Okay, so this is another early move. This is one of Cerebella's super moves, which are moves that we can take our time with, but I still took too long. I don't know why this is 45 frames. You can see it up there. It's a lot of frames for us. And I can actually share a couple technical details about this one. This move, fully finished, is 11 megabytes. In comparison, an average super move, that is another one of this kind of move, is about 4. So this move is 3 times as large as, a similar move for no real reason. Here it is again, same thing as before. I just took out frames, and I think this time it is a little bit choppier, so I would want to redo more than this. But I got it down to 29 frames. I think the motion is clearer and there's no unnecessary dawdling, and I think if I took the time to actually redo it properly, I could get it down to even less. Okay, one more, just really short one with our first character, Philia. This is her weak punch, and the original is 7 frames. I have it on the left. And I just removed 1 frame before she punches, and I think you can see just having that 1 frame taken out makes it a lot snappier. And 1 frame can just make a huge difference. And also a small dumb note about this one. We animated too much boob jiggle on the return to idle for this one, so our designer had to make her return to idle, a separate state, so you could interrupt it to go to a different animation. So we learned not to do that anymore. Okay, let's wrap it up. Here are the main points I hope you can take away today. Hitting and holding your key poses is more important than super smooth in-betweens. Since we work in games, we want to make sure everything is as clear as possible. Build toward your keys and use follow-through to fill in your gaps. The core parts of a move: the anticipation, the smear, the key, and the return to idle. I think if you think of a move in these parts, you actually don't need a lot of frames to get emotion across. And third, animation can and should work with your game design. You should never feel restricted by your game design. You should talk with your designer. What makes animation so fun and so great is how absolutely versatile it can be. And I want to share a few resources that have been invaluable to me. The first is Zweifus, which is a website that just indexes all the sprites from Street Fighter Third Strike. And it's something I reference pretty much every day because I think that is one of the best animated games out there, and just having the site that indexes it all is wonderful. And the second is Fighters Generation, which is just a general resource for fighting games, but what makes it best for animators is that it also just has a ton of sprites from all kinds of different games, and it's also just a great reference. And in general, study other games. Just study what you like, find out why you like it and what makes it good, and if you can, go through them frame by frame and really just get to know the stuff that you find most appealing. Okay, that wraps it up. Thank you all so much for coming. I guess we're all going to get lunch now. Sorry, I was nervous. And enjoy the rest of the boot camp.